we are recording.
Great. So thank you so much for this very interesting partnership webinar, Kaylee. And of course, as you know, we want to support you in any way that we can. So please tell us all about your project and let us know how NDGers can get involved and all the great benefits that are going to come from this.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so I will start by doing a screen share here. I have a small PowerPoint that I would love to go through. But I can introduce my team, which is here. We have Emma McLaughlin and Maya Catterall, which are two undergraduate students at Concordia University, and they are helping complete the tree team and conduct our field work and go through our data all summer, and they're joining us here. And can everyone see my screen all right? Looks good?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So the slides are in French, and then I'll be presenting in English just so we can kind of accommodate both languages. If you have any questions, we can throw them in the chat. And I'll basically just be going over the project itself, providing a bit of context of what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then I'm going to go through just a few kind of common questions that we've been receiving from our participants, maybe a few like obstacles people have faced while trying to measure their trees and things that we can clear up, and hopefully answer some questions so that we can engage a few more citizens to measure their own backyard trees. So starting off, I just wanted to talk a little bit about urban biodiversity in general. And so generally speaking, when we think about urban areas, a lot of us will kind of picture an area that looks similar to maybe this center picture, an area that's covered in large infrastructure and maybe some impermeable surfaces, concrete, and we don't usually consider kind of green spaces or areas filled with biodiversity. And apart from the fact that cities only take up about 3% of our global land cover, they actually house 55% of our population. And in North America, it's even higher. It's around 80% of our population. And so most of us are going to live and experience nature in some way through an urban context. And so biodiversity, apologies, I have the little cat joining us. And so urban biodiversity within cities can be a very practical place to look at these things. And on the photo on the right and the left, you can see that we have kind of these small sections of green space that cover our cities and can house trees, plants, and whatever it might be. And so this has kind of led to a body of work looking at biodiversity in cities and looking at how these environments are somewhat of a novel space. And so a lot of this work has focused on a urban to rural gradient, looking at maybe densely populated areas in our downtown core, all the way out to the peripheries of our city, and seeing how biodiversity changes across these gradients. And generally speaking, we actually have really high species richness in our cities, that being plants and trees. And that's because we've introduced a lot of species and we're able to manage them, like in your own backyard or in our gardens and things like that. And so these spaces can be a really great place for conservation. And so tying it back to trees, which is what we're really interested in this project, there's a number of ways that trees benefit us on both an individual scale and kind of all the way scaling up to our cities. And so this infographic is kind of a great capturing of all the ways in which a tree can provide us with benefits. It can save us in energy, help combat climate change in small ways of reducing our energy demand by cooling our backyards and our houses. It stores carbon, it sequesters carbon, and has a large impact on urban heat island. And so it can really reduce hot summer temperatures that we experience in the cities. It cleans our air and it captures rainwater and can really do a great job of controlling stormwater runoff. And of course, it improves our mental health and our well-being. It's great for us to get outside and sit in our backyard and enjoy that big maple tree or flowering crab apple that we have. And so it really can create a sense of place within our community. And so if we were to kind of look at this at both a small scale and all the way scaling up to our cities, you can see that one individual tree might provide one individual or a household some shade and some comfort in their own backyard, whereas a whole street of trees could create a more complex habitat that can support different insects, different plants, animals, and then all the way up to our cities where our entire urban forest and all of those kind of small green spaces combine to reduce our temperatures, combat that urban heat island, control our air quality, and improve it overall. And so this infographic just kind of shows where that idea comes from and how I'll kind of walk you through it. On the left here, we have this idea that there's a set of species or trees that could live in a city, and then it goes through a set of filters, whether that's filters from the environment, being temperature or soil quality, whatever it might be, or biotic filters, so things that we might change, the amount of fertilizer we put in our lawn or whatever it might be, that will change what trees specifically could survive where they are. And so after they go through these filters, you have our set of urban trees that we have on, say, the island of Montreal, and they possess a certain amount of characteristics that we call functional traits, and they're composed of different species across the landscape. And when you break that down, each tree has a set of processes that they go through that can provide us with those ecosystem services. And so towards the bottom here, you can see in the more light green area, some examples of what this might look like in a tree. And so if we were to focus on canopy cover, you have maybe a large Norway maple, which we see all over the city. It has this large canopy, and so that is intrinsically linked to the function of biomass production. And that biomass production plays a role in regulating temperature or sequestering carbon, and that results in an end service to us as individuals and the city as a whole. You could also think about it in the context of flowering. So you have maybe a flowering crabapple in your backyard. That's linked to a function of reproduction, but it actually leads to a final service of aesthetic value. And so you gain aesthetics in your backyard and across your community from those trees. And so the services that we get from these trees that combine in our backyards and create this urban forest in Montreal will depend on three things. One being what species are there, are they present or are they absent? What characteristics they have, characteristics like how tall are they, do they flower? What kind of canopy cover do they provide? And then we can look at how those are distributed across the landscape in those different green spaces. And so that kind of brings us to our project and what we want to do here with our NDG community inventory. And so this photo shows the public inventory of trees in Montreal. And so if people are unfamiliar, there's a website called QBio, where you can go and look at all of the trees on public land in Montreal. There are a few missing links, missing boroughs, but overall we have a really good idea of what trees are on public land. And so those would be the trees that are along your streets or in public parks. And so each of these dots, a different color represents a different species, and each of these dots is a different tree. And this is focused on NDG. So within Notre Dame de Grasse, this is what our treescape looks like. And it looks great. It looks like we have lots of trees, but if you were to actually zoom in, you can see that all of these green canopies are those that are in your backyard. And we have no idea what they are, what species they are, and all of those characteristics about them. And those comprise more than half of the trees within our community and across the island of Montreal. And so the hope with this project is that we can kind of start to fill the gaps and the missing links of those trees so that we can get to know better what we have here. Most of our research is really focused on these public trees. And the trees within your backyard might look very different than the tree that's along your street or within our parks. And so it's really important for us to kind of fill that gap. And that's where this project was kind of born out of. And so the overall objective of our research is to evaluate these public and private green spaces within NDG and consider how this tree composition and diversity is benefiting our community. And so we'll do this in a number of ways, but just to kind of break down things that we're interested in, we're basically looking at 4 different types of green spaces, but specifically this year, we're really interested in getting to know those residential backyards because we have no information on them at all. And so we'll be comparing urban parks, we'll be comparing street trees, backyards, and private institutional spaces. So those would be kind of places of worship, churches, and schools. And we'll be looking at diversity metrics of the number of species, how many are in these different green spaces, what kind of characteristics they have, which is what we consider a functional diversity, what functions are they providing, as well as their evenness across the entire island. And so generally kind of to just capture what the whole project looks at, if we're looking at urban diversity as a whole and the ecosystem services that that urban diversity can provide us, we have to understand the patterns of the species composition and the functional traits that they contain in order to understand the services and benefits that they provide our communities. And so we need to incorporate this private green space in order to understand that majority of missing trees that we haven't been able to survey yet. And this will hopefully allow us to make more informed decisions and management strategies for each community. The reality is that residents are probably playing or can play a really huge role in conservation and managing biodiversity within the city, which is great. But first we need to get to know kind of what's there and how we can manage it better. And so the 2 things that we're asking NDG residents through this project is 2 simple measurements that will allow us to get to know the trees in their own backyard. The first being a simple tree circumference measurement. So that's just taking a measuring tape, a string, a series of shoelaces, whatever you might have in your home, to measure around your trunk to get a general circumference, and that gives us an indication of the size of the tree. And then the second thing being 3 photos for identification. We're really encouraging residents to try and identify their own trees, and we have a number of resources that I'll go through just after this. But we're hoping to get these photos so that we can confirm that identification or do that identification for you. And so we're asking for 1 photo of the entire tree, 1 photo of the bark, and photos of the leaves and flowers, if possible, if it's flowering. And so if you're interested in identifying your trees, we've compiled a number of resources, but I'm just going to go through a few here that are just great resources to identify your own backyard trees that we've kind of compiled online. The first one is called LeafSnap. These are all free downloadable apps that help you identify trees and plants if you're interested in. But LeafSnap allows you to basically take a photo of tree leaves, tree bark, or flowers, whatever it may be, and upload it, and it will match it with certain confirmed IDs of trees, and you can kind of compare what you've taken and narrow down to a species or look into further based on these photo comparisons. The second one is iNaturalist, which some people might be familiar with, but this is a great online community looking at diversity, especially in urban areas. And so they have some downloadable tree guides that you can go through that are great for IDing, but as well, they kind of just have this great community where you can upload a photo and do that same kind of comparison and LeafSnap, or ask the community, oh, do you know this species? Do you have this species? Have you seen it before? And it can be a great kind of place to bounce off your ideas of what this species might be. And this one is also in French and English, which is really great. Branche is a local-based app, so this is actually linked to QBio, so that map that I showed earlier in my slides, it's linked up with this mobile app, which you can download, and you can explore the city across the island and look at all of those trees on public land. And so you can zoom in and see what tree is along your street or in the park around the corner, wherever you are. And it's great to kind of explore what tree species you have in the area and just get familiar with what those species look like. And the last one is called V-Tree, and it was developed through Virginia Tech University. This one is really extensive and can be really great. It provides kind of an interview process. You can go through and answer questions based on tree characteristics. and it'll narrow down to certain species. And it also allows you to narrow down on a geographic area. And so it'll focus in on the trees that would be found, say, within North America or within Eastern Canada, whatever it might be. And so that kind of wraps up the project itself and what we're doing and what we're asking for NDG residents. And then I've also just prepared a few slides on some common questions that we've been getting that I will run through here. I don't know if we have any questions, but I'm just going to keep going. And hopefully if there are any questions, this answers something that might be on someone's mind. So the first question we got, which was really interesting, is what if I live on a corner lot? And so your side yard might be your backyard. People were unsure about which trees to include and which trees to not. And so I've tried to kind of show a photo here. But basically the rule of thumb is that any tree that is street facing, so it's along a streetway, should be included in our public inventory. And so you can see this orange dot and green dot, those have been sampled by the city and we know what those are. But in the purple kind of rectangle, those are the backyard trees. Those are the ones that we don't know about. And so those would be the ones that you would be including in your backyard survey if you're located on a corner lot. Another tricky one that we get is what if my tree has multiple branches? And so this can look different based on different tree species, but here I've just used an example of a lilac tree. And so this has multiple shoots and multiple stems. And so how do you go about measuring that when you have so many? And so taking that circumference, we're asking for it to be taken at 1.3 meters height. And basically, if you have a multiple stem species, you're going to be measuring each of those trunks individually and submitting those to us. And so you can kind of see in this photo, there are a bunch of red lines. And so we would measure each of those circumferences and submit them separately. And then we can convert them and use them to kind of calculate a rough volume for the tree. Another question we get is what trees do we include? Is there some kind of threshold? Is a tree too small? Is a tree too big? And this question and answer can be different based on kind of what questions you're asking. But for our research, we've created a threshold of a 1 meter height. And so if your tree is over 1 meter, and then a circumference of 15 centimeters. And so if your tree circumference is below that 15 centimeter threshold, we don't need to include it in this inventory. And lastly, I just wanted to go through kind of tips and tricks for good photos for identification. So since we're really relying on these photos to confirm the IDs, it's great to just kind of provide some insight on what makes a good photo for us and helps us really identify a species. So the first thing is just kind of to make sure that there aren't any large obstructions within whatever you're focusing on. So this is a really great example from one of our participants of the bark. As you can see, it's really clearly focused on the bark. And there are no obstructions in view that are making it less focused. And this gives us a really great way to be able to see and distinguish this bark texture, which can be a really great way to identify and separate different species. Another one is the leaves. Most of the time, I would say leaves are the most useful piece of information for us for identification. And so there are kind of two things that we're looking for. One thing that can be really useful is getting a more zoomed out version of the leaves. And this gives us an idea of the arrangement of the leaves and how they're arranged along the branches. And then a more zoomed in focus pictures of the individual leaf can be great for us to be able to get to know kind of what species it might be. Does it have toothed edges? Is it uneven? And that can be great for species identification. We have had a few cases where people have been unable to kind of reach the branches of their trees or the leaves because it's so big, which is great. But in that case, what we've been asking is if you see any leaves kind of surrounding the trees that have fallen off, if you can pick those up and kind of grab a photo of those should be great for us to be able to identify. And so just some resources, those are the wrap up of my questions, but there are some great websites also. There's an Arbor Day website that allows you to go through kind of what tree is this. done with the trees on public and private land, kind of surrounding a 1 square kilometer radius around their campus. And so with that, I just want to say thank you to Eco-Quartier for hosting us and for supporting us. It's been really great to have collaborators within the community. You can always go and learn more about the project on our website or through our Facebook page. We're trying to constantly share and engage citizens. You can always shoot us an email if you have any questions. We're around and we're in the community, so we hope to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. That was fantastically informative.
Okay, I'm gonna stop my share here and hopefully that's okay. Okay.
So, I had a few questions, but I was wondering if anybody else wanted to go first.
Actually, I had a question. So you're talking about the 1 meter height and 15 centimeters circumference threshold. So how is that like determined for the trees?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this kind of goes into the nitty-gritty gray area of what is a tree and what is a shrub. And that can be, like I said, there are kind of different answers to that question based on what you're really interested in. And so for us, we kind of created this threshold, usually within forestry, there's a threshold of a 5 centimeter DBH, which is diameter at breast height. And that converts roughly to a 15 centimeter circumference. And that is a rough kind of distinction between trees and shrubs. But that being said, for us, we also thought it would be important to kind of stay on the lower end of that because we would like to include kind of those shrubs that are a bit more tree-like or kind of bridge that gap. So things like lilacs that people really like to have in their backyard and likely will show up time and time again. We wanted to be able to include those as well. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. It was very perfect. My question perfectly.
Madame Zara, avez-vous des questions?
Pas vraiment, j'essaie de bien assimiler tout le contenu.
Beaucoup d'informations.
Oui, tout à fait.
So Kaylee, you were showing on one slide that was the public trees of Montreal, and you had a number of species that probably repeat over and over and over, like the Norwegian maple, the silver maple, and a bunch of others.
Yes.
I'm imagining that when it comes to people's private trees and they have the opportunity to go to a nursery or to go find something that's maybe grafted or exotic or that kind of thing, I'm guessing, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that all of a sudden your diversity of species might really open up as compared to what the city is able to plant.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's another thing that we're really interested in seeing and kind of diving a bit more into, because the idea here is that we might be seeing a lot more maybe ornamentals or exotic species, things that are available through a nursery or that might provide those kind of aesthetic nice things to our backyard that we really like to enjoy that maybe wouldn't do as well along a street because those areas can be quite high stress. And so that's what we do see usually is along those streets, we might have a high evenness. So there's a lot of evenness among what those tree species are, but a very low richness. And so there's only a few species that can actually do well in that environment, that kind of high stress. And so you see those same trees showing up time and time again, Norway. Today we were out measuring and it was linden. And so it's interesting to see, and I think it'll be interesting to see how much that differs, but I think it will.
I know nothing about this, maybe like so small that I ask a question but don't know any of the answers. I've recently started understanding about the underground networks of trees and how they share resources and all the rest of it, and I'm imagining that's also going to be impacted in your project also. But I guess I've never understood if it has to be the same species of trees or if it's a different species, if they might also share underground and if that might enrich the trees that we have.
Yeah, I see Maya's reaction. I know that Maya and I have discussions on this. She might be able to answer this question better than I have. I'm not as familiar with the kind of like underground networks, but I don't know, Maya, do you have maybe you're on mute, sorry. Yeah.
I know usually it's like So most of the time, like in a forest, it'll be like the mother tree that's sending stuff to like the little saplings. But in the book, The Secret Life of Trees, they talk about, I don't remember what 2 species they are, but they very much like occur together when they're growing naturally in a forest. And so they're able to share networks between each other. But usually it's like particular to the species.
Okay, thank you. I had other questions. My other questions. How many responses have you received so far from NDG participants, and how many would you like to have? And is there an overwhelming number that might be too much?
Oh, that's a great question. So right now we're sitting at about 50 participants, and then we've just been, well, in the last month or so, we've been given permission to include backyards for residents that might not be able to conduct the survey themselves. And so each one of us can go out individually and survey those backyards for anyone that maybe doesn't have access to be able to do it themselves. And so that's, I'm hoping, going to push us up to 70, and we have them kind of filtering in week by week. Our hope is that we could reach minimum 100. That would be a great kind of starting point for us to get a good indication of the community. I don't know if there's an overwhelming. I think maybe the overwhelming would be the timing. We weren't sure of when things would push out because we're IDing these as they're coming in. And now that we have kind of going out in the field and also being at home, I think maybe we could get a small backlog of trying to identify those species submissions. But I mean, the more the better. I will take as many submissions as are thrown at me, and I will find a way to get through them.
Fantastic. I really believe that there's a lot of people who would like to participate who haven't heard about the project yet or might be a little intimidated, but honestly, when you break it down, it just seems so easy that absolutely anybody could do it.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. We've tried, that's been a great learning curve for us and for the transition of the project, is trying to kind of find new ways and make sure that it's as accessible as possible. Being limited to an online platform kind of limits us a little bit, and that we can't engage in the way that we normally would. But I mean, we're always open to feedback, and we've tried to make the project kind of as straightforward as we can.
And like Kaylee was mentioning as well, like if people do feel intimidated by doing it themselves, or if they have, you know, over 20 trees in their backyard and kind of don't know where to start, feel free to reach out to us, and we can definitely come to you guys at a safe distance and do it ourselves.
That sounds fantastic. Is there another way that the Éco-Quartier could help you to promote your project? I know that you've been doing some drop-offs in mailboxes and things like that. I'm thinking about some of the groups that we work with, like we have a seniors table, and the seniors table, often they have their own homes. They've had them for a long time. Maybe yes, they would, you know, invite somebody into their backyard to measure their trees, or maybe there's different groups we could promote with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be one small way. We've kind of taken 2 different directions in that sense. Is we've kind of thought of these 2 different directions of education. This is like a great activity that you can take out during, like, for teachers or for families to be able to kind of take out your kids and explore your backyard and get to know those trees. And so we've created worksheets for that, but I really would like to expand on the kind of senior community. I know that there is a very lively community within NGG, and we have received kind of a few emails of saying, oh, like, I'm not able to upload these photos, I don't have access to the internet, or I don't have a camera, or whatever it might be. And for those individuals, we really would still like to include you and engage you and help you participate. And so if you have those connections, absolutely that would help us to kind of bridge that gap.
Great.
I don't know if you guys are still doing like booths in the community, but if so, like, even if we have kind of like a little flyer that people can look at, kind of, yeah, just to get the word out a bit more.
It's funny you say that, Emma, because in COVID times, they weren't sure about that. And I finally got, even the Petri Vert don't know, I finally got the yes today for 3
Yay! Woohoo, yeah. we were talking about that a bit, like about a month ago, of talking about whether we could maybe set up in a park, and just talk to residents, engage, and see if we could reach a few more people that haven't heard about the project yet.
I'll send you the invitation, see if you want to join us.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Also, if you have any pamphlets, like we could use those when we have booths and stuff. That would be something interesting, and it goes with our mandate too of urban forests. So
yeah, we have a few flyers like that we did for our mail drop, and so I have some extra copies of those that we could probably exchange. Kind of go through.
All right, yeah, that would be great.
Personally, I find your project very, very exciting, and I think that there's a lot of energy that can be put behind it. And once you have your data, I think that's also going to be exciting. I'm excited for the two parts. I'm excited to get people participating and excited about their trees and looking at them in a great way. And then on the other side, I'm really excited to see what you guys learn, what we can generally learn from this. I mean, I personally think this is a unique project for Montreal. Correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, I think it's going to show so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I hope so too. I have my fingers crossed. I'm excited to see what we find. I really, now that we're starting to move in and see kind of submissions coming in and see those species, I'm really interested in. So we'll hopefully create in the early fall kind of a small results of this is how many trees we got to know and this is how many residents participated, and stay tuned for results. Hopefully we'll be able to do a workshop or maybe another online webinar depending on how things go, and be able to kind of give back what we found.
Is there a deadline for residents to submit their data?
We have kind of a rough deadline of, I'm edging towards the start of October. So the idea is that the best time to identify trees is when there are leaves on those trees. And so moving into the fall, we wanted to keep September kind of open because we have a few schools and educators that are interested in asking their students to perform their own backyard tree surveys. And so they won't be back until September. So we're going to keep things open to kind of include those submissions. And then we'll probably close things off at the beginning of October.
That's fantastic.
I did also want to add that we have a contest going on as well. So anyone who submits a response basically gets entered into a draw to win a Honeycrisp apple tree for their backyard, if they want it. But yeah, so that might give some incentive to some more people to participate.
That's fantastic. One thing I was thinking about the city trees of Côte-des-Neiges and DG, my understanding from the people who work in the parks who maintain the trees, there's not a big interest in having fruit or nut trees because there's a lot of wastage, let's call it, from people who don't bother picking. It falls in the street, it makes a big mess. Right. I'm expecting you're going to see a big diversity in terms of that happening in gardens, because I know from our project, A Tree for My Borough, there's a lot of apple trees and other fruit trees that are bought. So I think that could also be really interesting data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that does ring true as well. Like I think, well, just based on some of the work that we've done, like you definitely see a lot more kind of flowering and fruiting species within backyards. We kind of see both that same kind of Norway maples are the ones that are really common in the city. We still see those are pretty prominent in backyards. That's still true. But then we also see this kind of distinction of those flowering, fruiting trees showing up, which is really interesting to kind of see those merge.
In your data, have you found any fruit trees on public property?
We have a few, yeah, actually we sampled a few in parks, but I think definitely along streets, none. There are service berries, it seems like, that are really popping up. Those seem to be a popular choice right now. And so those are technically fruiting. They're much smaller and flowering. But in terms of more traditional like pears, crab apples, or domestic apple trees, you don't see those as often, and they would be contained well within the park and not along streets. Yeah.
So interesting. Well, I think for the moment, that's it for my general questions. I have some maybe detailed questions that I'd like to write to you guys about just how we can, help you with your partnership in general.
Yeah, absolutely.
but I was wondering, should we conclude here? Are there more questions? Should we keep going?
Yeah, if there are no more questions, we can wrap up. I'm glad we have this recording, so hopefully we can kind of both share it on our platforms. This will be great for us to kind of have those slides to send out to the community. But yeah, if there are no more questions, a big thank you again.
A big thank you to you.
And stay in touch.
Thank you.
Merci, Madame Zara.
Merci à tout le monde.
Have a great night. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.